Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a good day to all of you. In today's video, I'll be covering on a content which is called Secure Software Supply Chain. Okay, this content will be in two parts. Let's look at the content that will be covered in this video. So basically, we are going to look at what is software supply chain. Right, so it's actually a bigger scope of what we have been covering before. We will also cover things which is related to the software after the software have been in the production and also during maintenance. Going to also look at risk management, but in the context of software supply chain. And then there are some concepts in supply chain which is related to pedigree and provenance, which is actually referring to the same thing, and also additional consideration when dealing with cyber supply chain. Okay, let's have a look at what software supply chain is. It's actually referring to a bigger picture of what we have seen before. It's not only related to development, it's also looking at the interconnected processes that happen throughout development, throughout deployment. We are also going to look at it's also include the tools that are being used throughout the development. So what are the components, whether it's a third party, whether it's an API that have been used in the software. And all these components are actually involved during the development. When it's ready, it is being distributed to the client's offices, organization, and after it has been used for quite some time, it need to be managed. It need to be maintained, right? So what you can see here, software supply chain is actually, it's not only processes, it's always also involve tools, not only during the development or during testing or during the deployment when it's ready, but also we need to consider it after it is in the maintenance stage, where it need to be updated and revised and so on. So you can see that supply chain is even larger in scope. So it involves, when we are talking about software supply chain, it's you look at the source code which has been developed, whether it is in-house or being outsourced. Software supply chain also involve looking at the dependencies with the third-party libraries that the software are being using it, or if the software are being developed on certain framework. Nowadays there are many web framework available, so the framework that been used also need to be considered. Also related to the development tools that the developer been used. All right, so it also include when the system are ready to be delivered. Okay, what platform are being used for distributing of the software, whether it is an application, mobile application, is in the App Store, Google Play, and so on, and whether it's software running on cloud services or not. Right, as a software supply chain also involve what happened during maintenance, so it also been looking at whether the libraries or the framework that been used, is it being updated regularly, whether if there are any security fix updated. So looking at, as I keep on mentioning it, is we are going to look at the bigger picture of software being developed, deployed, distributed, and maintained. Of course, it involves multiple stakeholders. Many people are involved. All right. So what happens if the software that we buy for the organization is an open source code? Okay. we don't really, if we are not concerned about this, we simply use whatever that we buy. We need to know, um, uh, before buying certain software, you need to know what are the technology being used, what are the components, what are the libraries that have been called, and so on, because at this point of time, the software that we build or we use are no longer developed by us. It is being developed based on reliance on many other components. For example, during the development, we rely on third-party codes or APIs that we use, okay, so that we don't really know what are the vulnerabilities uh, that exist in the libraries or components that we are using. All right, so looking at the point of view of a security concern, security practitioner not only simply using it, use the component or use the framework available. We need to also see whether is there any risk of vulnerabilities or defects that we inherit from the software supply chain. Okay, I mean that let's say we are using certain APIs or certain components, ready components that we bought open source from certain companies. So we don't really have control over what are the vulnerabilities that the client, the previous vendor have identified. Okay, so that was the concern here. So the concern about security is beyond our control. Not only that, uh, in the software supply chain, we need to look uh, from the bigger perspective, as mentioned before, whereby software development is a global activities. Maybe will be many companies, various countries will be participating. Okay, maybe you get one component, third-party software from a different company, which is from a different company, right? And you if you want to perform support or verification, maybe it's hard to get it, okay, because it's beyond your control. Um, all right, so what is the concern here is that talking about software supply chain, so we don't simply, whenever we acquire a third-party software, we need to do additional research on it. Research in terms of studying what are the risks involved. Okay, so right, so all these points here are saying, explaining to you that because there are so many parties involved, so you need um, to have a formal agreement spelled out in the agreement or in the collaboration. Okay, so what he's saying here is that because there are numerous organizations participating in the production of a software, so we need to have some sort of agreement. Okay, something went wrong, so who might be involved? Okay, rather than leaving everything on the client that bought it. Okay, so before this, you have heard about software testing, software quality assurance, right? So because of this concern relating to software supply chain, there's also the need of a study which is called software supply chain assurance. It's more like a testing, kind of testing, but it's done on a larger scale. Okay, to it, I can say this is a sort of testing which is done to get confidence that the software product function as intended and is reliable and safe, right? So it is done in a larger scale. Okay, let's look at software supply chain risk management. I think we have come across um, uh, matters related to risk management many times, right? So the same goes here. We are going to look at risk management, but in the context of software supply chain. So if you still remember, this is NIST. If you remember, Federal Information System and an organization, which is this is among this. If a company is trying to get project with the U.S. government, they need to follow some of these standards here. So, but in this NIST, it's actually defining what supply chain risk management practice is. It's saying that in ICT supply chain risk, uh, it, it is actually associated with organization decreased visibility. So as we in developing a software, we sometimes depend on certain vendors. So some of the codes and technology are not shared with us. We are only given it in the form of runnable software. So due to that reason, it decreased the visibility. We cannot see what are the technology, what are the algorithm, whether they have conducted any security measures or not, right? We don't. It has decreased our visibility, and also it has increased the decreased the understanding of how the technology that they acquire to develop. Okay, the third party or our vendors that we depend on, we don't really know how they develop the technology. Okay, how do they integrate and how do they deploy, and when we integrate it together with us, some of this information are missing. So they are also associated with the process, procedures, and practices used to assure that the product services uh, integrity. We don't really know all this because some of this information is missing. So looking at risk management, basically there are four processes. I think we keep on seeing this before. First is to identify the risk. Okay, but this is looking at the context of supply chain. This process basically forcing the security practitioner to sit down and to analyze what are, if they use any third party or if they depend on other suppliers, it is forcing the security practitioners to sit down and think what are possible risks that the third party software might be imposed to. Okay, and then assess the risk, whether is it very harmful to the organization, then try to respond based on what they have identified. They have strategy on how to respond to it, and then keep on monitoring whether the risk reduce or still there, right? So what it is saying is that the organization, when they acquire any software or any components or any services, network services, database services, for example, it is the responsibility of the organization to do investigation, to do assessment first before they decide whether they want to buy from the vendor or not, and then integrate. And after they have decide whether uh, it's suitable or is it secure enough for the organization, then they do the integration, right? So they basically need to identify possibilities of the software or the processes that they buy from the organization, other organization, and then from there they, after defining or identifying the possibilities that would happen from depending on certain component from third party, so they need to assess um, they need to assess based on the threat, the policies of the companies, the constraint that the company have. They need to think about the possibility of, if it's happened, what are the impact. All right. Um, So looking at the point of view of security, so we are looking more on the perspective of security of supply chain. So we need to look at how this cyber security focused supply chain risk assessment should be incorporated into the enterprise higher level risk assessment processes. So it should be done at a higher level. Right. In risk management, basically there are 4 processes. So let's look at the third and the fourth one. So based on the identified risk, the probability that it will happen and the impact that will incurred on the organization. So there are basically, as you know, there are 4 ways on how to respond. The first one is to accept it. Accept it if the identified risk is within the tolerance, the organization can tolerate with it. Okay, so let's say if something happened, the impact is not that much, it can be tolerable by the organization, so maybe they can accept it, right? Other option is to avoid it, is to try to avoid it from happening, to eliminate any activities or the use of technology that could contribute to the risk. The third one is to mitigate. You understand the risk and you try to reduce it. You can either require the software supplier inherit can require that a software supplier inherit the receiver organization development best practice. All right, meaning that maybe at this point of time, what they can do some verification. They can do the testing first to see whether certain technology that they are using can be made more secure. And the last one is when the fourth kind of response, whenever a risk has been identified, is to transfer it. Okay, maybe because the organization doesn't have the capacity to provide a secure environment, maybe they need to hire a security organization, maybe hiring different parties to make sure that this software can be made, can monitor the level of security in the organization. Okay, so I think this is a basic response, but this is more looking at the point of view of supply chain. And lastly, in risk management process is there's a monitoring process whereby once they have decided the type of response that the organization need to do, so they need to monitor to see whether the evaluation that have been done have reduced the impact of the risk or not, and the organization may need to do discussion with the system integrator, the supplier, and any external service provider about the implication and mutual obligation when the risk happen. Okay, so basically that's a general process of risk management, right? And due to this reason, there is a new study that have been a new practice that have been introduced to handle risk management specifically for cybersecurity, more specifically on the cyber aspect, where they call it as supply chain risk management, right? So they addresses issues or risks more related to cybersecurity. Okay. All right, so because different organizations have different kind of business, so it is very customized to different businesses, and the company need to do some investment if they think that cyber security chain risk management is important for them, so they need to allocate some resources, to allocate some budget on it. right? The organization must carefully evaluate the benefit of CSCRM on the risk exposure that they have identified, right? And if they choose not to do CSCRM, it would affect both of the supplier and those who act, both have supplier and act as supplier, right? So those who are involved in the entire production of the software will be affected with possible attacks. All right, looking at supply chain risks, um, the thing that you need to think about is that sometimes, as we have mentioned before, in the software production there are many parties involved. Maybe the company use some of the component from the third party, right? And then some are being developed in-house. Okay, so there are possibility that the cyber security risk that is uh, might be experienced by a software product is inherited from the supplier, okay, or the supplier supply chain, okay. So what I could say here is that it's something beyond of the development team, right? What happened here is that it has increased the organization exposure to threats and vulnerabilities. It's beyond our control. So before this, we can, if it's been developed in-house, maybe we can control. So how it can be, we can start thinking about doing misuse case to think about possible threats, vulnerabilities, right? But because this one here is it involve other organization, different companies as well. So there is a possibility that theft of software could happen, the intellectual property or the customer data are being involved here because there are so many parties involved. So maybe the the testing team uh, who might can be from a different organization. When they are conducting the software testing, they might steal some of the codes, or they can see some of the customer data, right? So of course this will affect the business operation and also at the same time cripple the market reputation. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so this is a bigger picture related to supply chain where there are so many other parties involved. Right, let's look at the possible threat and vulnerabilities. Okay, if it's the attacker, if it's a purposely attempt to attack, right? Or what he or she can do, or the group can do, is that it can insert the malware, right? Because maybe the company is using a third-party software, and that component open to insertion of malware or industrial espionage. Okay, there are other companies are spying on you, right? They can either copy your software and make a different version of your software with slightly different features or interface, for example. Maybe our attacker is disrupting the supply of our vendor, right? Maybe there is, because there are many organizations involved from different companies, there are also foreign intelligence entity that might be involved here, right? Even though it's not related to any attack by the adversarial, because we are depending on other parties. Let's say our vendor involved in a natural disaster, so maybe our services are being disrupted. uh, the vendor that we depend on is not achieving the quality that we want. Okay, maybe there are war at our vendors organization, or maybe our vendor or our third party organization is having a legal or maybe there are some regulation change, right, on our country that is not supported by the other organization, right? So looking at the bigger picture, depending on different components, the possible vulnerability that can happen is that um, looking at the external point of view, so we are depending on there are interdependence of supply chain. Okay, our software depend on a different component, that component depend on other third party component and so on. Alright, so maybe there are some weaknesses along the way in the software, so it's beyond our control, or maybe the vendor that providing us the services is not doing enough checking on the weaknesses of their own information system. Maybe they do not handle patches regularly, or maybe the organization that the vendor that we depend on is not having enough or are lacking in terms of the cyber awareness, right? So looking at this cyber supply chain, the kind of lost impact that will bring to our organization, maybe we will have impacted with the loss of customer and public trust due to data disclosure, right? There are maybe because the system that we depend on from the vendor that was impacted by natural disaster happened several days ago, and due to that reason our production is cannot be started. Okay, or maybe along the way, because we depend on third parties and that third party somehow get access to our software, and we lost our intellectual property. All the ideas are not being documented and registered, so maybe our idea are being stolen along the way. Okay, so these are, you can see that these are the bigger picture that is involved in supply chain, because there are so many parties involved. There are so many other dependencies that happen along the way, not only during the development, during the deployment, and also during the maintenance. So looking at this, there are during supply chain, we need to manage our third-party components, okay, because we depend on different organization, different vendors along the way. So we need to actually record what are other third parties involved. Okay, so our security team need to look at each one of these components and look at possible security vulnerabilities that exist. So we need to know, are the organization or the customer software impacted by a specific components that have been identified. Okay, let's say we receive a report that the third party that the company is currently using are being attacked by certain group of hackers, and that component are also being used by our organization. So we want to know whether the organization are impacted with it, or whether the customer software or their data are being infected by this attack. So this is a process that need to be done not only at the end, but also need to be done during the software development life cycle. Okay, so we need to know what are other third-party components being used throughout the development. Okay, we need to maintain the list. We need to perform secure security risks, we need to assess where each of the component, third-party components that we use, is there any possibility of, is it open to any vulnerabilities or not? If there is, you need to mitigate or accept the risk and then keep on monitoring. So this two process is more on identifying the risk management. Okay, so throughout the software development cycle, so if there are any third parties component, you need to identify throughout the cycle, and then along the way you need to do assessment whether is there any security risk from each of the component, and try to mitigate and monitor whether the risk has been reduced or not. Right. Other than that, because this is related to supply chain, right? Not only that, we need to identify what are the third-party components that been used. The company or the supplier that provide us with the service need to have this documentation, software bill of materials, okay, SBOM. Right, so basically what this is actually a formal record containing detail and supply chain relationship with various components. Okay, so the third party component, what are the components being used, how they are related, need to be documented. Right, software developers and vendors often create products by assembling many open source, many commercial components, so we need to record that. Alright, so that it is transparent throughout, so we know if certain components are being attacked, we know who owns it, what are other components might be affected with it, looking at the relationship, right? There are certain minimum elements of an effective SBOM, include what are the data fields, the processes, and some support for automation, right? So there are, because this process are being, you need to record it throughout, okay? So normally they have come up with certain format on how to record this information, the SBOM information, and because they want to automate it, so there are certain format of data that represent SBOM. Alright, so I think you have come across with SWID before. It's actually one of the standards being used to support SBOM. It's basically a format on how to represent data related to the software. Alright, SBOM need to be integrated into the contractual requirement as early as in the software lifecycle. Right, so this documentation on third party, what version, who this component relates to what component, okay, need to be also be integrated during implementation phase, right, whereby at this point of time it can be tested to see what are the dependencies of the third party software, and also SBOM should also be maintained and used to identify and address vulnerabilities within the organization software infrastructure. Okay, so we need to also know what are other vulnerabilities that happen within the software infrastructure. Alright, so as I've mentioned just now, because SBOM need to be automated, so it need to have certain format, right, and we need to be able to track it. So this information should be mapped easily to license and also the vulnerability resources. So among the information being captured in SBOM is the supplier name, the supplier original software name, version, unique, maybe you can need to give ID, so it depends on what component, what is the author name of the SBOM, and time and date of SBOM being created, because there are many versions, so we need to know